Welcome back, everyone. I'm Jordan Giesige, and this is The Limiting Factor. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers like BYD can produce EVs in China for less than half the cost that they can be produced in Western countries. Now that they've started achieving scale in China, the next obvious move is to export those vehicles to Western markets, which has rightfully triggered panic in Western automakers. Given that the largest auto market in the world outside of China is the US, it naturally raises the question, what strategies do Chinese automakers have to enter the US market? And if they do, how will Tesla and other US manufacturers compete with an onslaught of increasingly competitive low-cost Chinese EVs? And turning the question on its head, how will Chinese companies fare against competition from Tesla, which is positioning itself to go after the bread and butter of Chinese automakers, which is low-cost vehicles? Before we begin, a special thanks to my Patreon supporters, YouTube members, and Twitter subscribers, as well as Rebellionaire.com. They specialize in helping investors manage concentrated positions. Rebellionaire can help with covered calls, risk management, and creating a money master plan from your financial first principles. Additionally, a special thanks to Larry Goldberg for reviewing the video. If you don't follow Larry on X, it's worth doing so. He has a wealth of insights about Tesla and business in general as a successful serial entrepreneur and investor. Let's start with how imports of low-cost Chinese EVs could affect Tesla in the U.S. auto market. To do that, we first need to understand the tariffs and trade agreements that are in place. Only a few days ago, the U.S. increased its tariffs on Chinese EVs to 100%. Let's take a look at how that affects the price of a China-made BYD Seal versus the US-made Model 3 as an example. I'm picking these two companies and vehicles because they're the two most competitive EV manufacturers in the world, and because the Seal and the Model 3 are in the same vehicle class and roughly the same size. Let's take a closer look. A China-made rear-wheel drive BYD Seal with the equivalent of about 315 miles of EPA range and a 0 to 60 of around 7 seconds costs about $28,000. A US-made rear-wheel drive Tesla Model 3 with 272 miles of EPA range and a 5.8 second 0 to 60 costs $39,000. That is, each vehicle has strengths and weaknesses, but the Seal is quite a bit cheaper. However, if we add the 100% tariff to the Seal, and let's say $1,000 for shipping it across the Pacific, that would come to a total of $57,000, making it about $18,000 more expensive than the Model 3. That is, the 100% tariff is far more help than Tesla needs to compete with Chinese imports. So why was the tariff increased to 100%? It was to protect legacy automakers. But even a 100% tariff on Chinese imports may not be enough to help legacy autos survive. That's because so far, they're fundamentally unable to produce an EV that's desirable, low cost, and profitable. Ford, for example, is losing $130,000 on each EV they produce. I use Ford's numbers because they're the only legacy manufacturer reporting their losses, but their losses are likely fairly representative of what other U.S. automakers are experiencing. With the 100% tariff effectively blocking direct imports from China to the U.S., what could be the next chess move for a Chinese automaker like BYD to enter the U.S. market? They could build a factory in Mexico. That would achieve three things. First, thanks to lower wages, it would allow them to access lower production costs than if they'd built a factory in the U.S. Second, by building factories in Mexico, they could take advantage of the USMCA, which is the free trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. That would allow them to sidestep the 100% tariff that would be incurred by directly importing from China. Third, it would help them meet the requirements for the $7,500 customer tax credit. If BYD gained those advantages, would it allow them to turn the tables on Tesla and outcompete them? In my opinion, no. That's because in order to avoid tariffs through the USMCA free trade agreement and to access the $7,500 customer tax credit, BYD would have to meet the requirements of each. For the USMCA, the primary requirement is that 75% of the vehicle content would have to be made in North America. For the $7,500 customer tax credit, there are a number of requirements, but the two most relevant for this video are as follows. First, the critical mineral requirement, which awards half of the $7,500. It states that a certain portion of the raw materials in the battery have to be mined or processed in the U.S. or in a country that has a free trade agreement with the U.S. Second, the battery component requirement, which awards the other half of the $7,500 tax credit. It states that a certain portion of the finished materials in the battery have to be manufactured or assembled in the U.S. or North America. As some people will point out, there's also, of course, a $45 per kilowatt-hour manufacturing tax credit for batteries. But that only applies to battery cells and packs assembled in the United States, not Mexico. So they would have to build a separate battery factory in the U.S. to access those credits. What all this means is that in order for Chinese companies to become competitive selling vehicles in the U.S., they would also have to rebuild most of their supply chain in Mexico, the U.S., and in countries the U.S. has free trade agreements with. That means their production costs would essentially become the same as any other vehicle factory in Mexico that has similar manufacturing efficiency. In other words, by building vehicles in Mexico for the U.S. market, Chinese automakers would lose most, if not all, the production cost advantages they have from vehicles they make in China. And of course, on that note, Tesla intends to start building vehicles out of Mexico in the next year or two. That factory is slated to use their next-generation unboxed manufacturing lines that, on a like-for-like basis, could reduce the cost of manufacturing a vehicle by at least 13.5% compared to any other manufacturer with a similar supply chain. That is, even with a factory in Mexico, I don't view BYD as a threat to Tesla in the U.S. auto market. In fact, as we'll see in a moment, BYD has just as much to fear from Tesla as Tesla does from BYD. Additionally, another factor worth taking into account is that vehicle profits will increasingly come from software rather than hardware. If Tesla solves full self-driving, they could sell their vehicles at cost and earn most of their profits from services rather than the hardware. That would really put BYD back on its heels because BYD has said that full self-driving is basically impossible, which means that if it is possible, which looks increasingly likely, they're leaving the field wide open for Tesla. Before we move on, it's worth addressing a counter-argument that might come up in the comments. If we look at another example of where Tesla and BYD have localized their supply chain in the same country, China, BYD appears to be fundamentally more competitive. That's because the BYD seal in China costs about $28,000, as compared to the $34,000 for a similar Model 3 produced in China, a $6,000 difference. Wouldn't that put holes in the argument that Tesla would be competitive with BYD if both localized their supply chains to Mexico? In my view, there are four factors to take into account here. First, BYD's net profit margin in Q3 of last year was 6.42%, whereas for Tesla it was 7.94%. However, BYD's net profit margin includes both pure electric vehicles and also plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Pure battery electric vehicles are more difficult to produce profitably than hybrids, so it's likely BYD's EV business is running near break-even or potentially even losing money. That's as opposed to Tesla, which only sells EVs. That means there's likely room for Tesla to cut the price of their Model 3 and still be profitable, whereas BYD would likely be losing money if they did the same. To account for the fact that Tesla is likely earning a higher margin, let's reduce the price of the China-made Model 3 to $32,000, meaning the price difference between a Seal and a Model 3 using a similar supply chain is more like $4,000 rather than $6,000, which is probably conservative. The second factor is that the Tesla Model 3 gets better reviews. That's because it's overall a better vehicle. It has 50% more cargo volume in the same form factor, can handle 55 to 66% more charging power, has better safety assist features, has much better handling, and slightly better interior quality and appeal. That is, the Tesla arguably provides $4,000 more in value for the extra $4,000 in price. Third, Tesla's take rate for full self-driving in China is low because it's still not useful enough to appeal to Chinese consumers. That's likely to change with newer versions of the software. That is, much like I said above for the US market, full self-driving may allow Tesla to reduce the price of the vehicle hardware and earn most of the profits on software instead, which will take years for BYD to replicate. So overall, at first glance, although it appears that BYD has a big cost advantage in China, it would be more accurate to say that BYD is more willing to lose money on each vehicle to grow market share, and that each company is in a slightly different value bracket. I expect a similar dynamic to play out for vehicles produced by BYD and Tesla in Mexico that are headed to the US market, with the key difference being that Tesla's Mexico factory will use the unboxed process. If that's able to save at least 13.5% on the cost of production, that would make the price floor of a Model 3 using that process the same or lower than the price of a BYD Seal. But, of course, Tesla is not expected to build the Model 3 in Mexico, but rather their next-generation compact vehicle platform, which potentially includes a robotaxi and a low-cost vehicle that's sold directly to the public. This is where things get interesting, and it's why I said earlier that BYD has just as much to fear from Tesla as Tesla does from BYD. To understand why, let's take a look at the broader picture. We're at a pivotal time in the long-term business strategy of both Tesla and BYD, which might become a great business case study in the future. Tesla's strategy for the past 15 years has been to move from larger, higher-priced vehicles to smaller, lower-priced vehicles, whereas BYD has always been considered more of a budget option that's working towards being competitive with the best brands on the planet, like Tesla. We're now getting to the point where BYD and Tesla are crossing over into what each company considers their bread and butter. So will BYD outcompete Tesla in the entry-level luxury and luxury market, or will Tesla outcompete BYD in the budget vehicle market? If we look at the sales of the BYD Seal versus the Tesla Model 3, so far a pattern hasn't yet emerged because the Seal is a relatively new vehicle. Bear in mind when looking at the graph on screen that in the third quarter of last year, Tesla had to shut down and re-ramp production to refresh the Model 3, and that BYD could have experienced extra demand for the Seal while it was the new hot thing on the market at the end of 2022. That is, it's too early to say how Model 3 sales have been affected by the BYD Seal. But that says something in itself. A common strategic play for Chinese companies is to trade profits to take market share, which allows them to create scale and reduce costs, and eventually leads to market domination and profits. But despite BYD's entry into the entry-level luxury vehicle market and likely selling their vehicles at or below cost, Model 3 sales have held up well. However, what happens when Tesla introduces more affordable vehicles that, on a like-for-like basis, cost at least 13.5% less thanks to Tesla's unboxed manufacturing process? If Tesla delivers, the result will be vehicles that cost up to half as much to make as a Tesla Model 3, but still offer Tesla's typical high-quality appeal. That is, Tesla could set new standards for value at a lower price point, which is exactly what the Model 3 did about 5 years ago. It changed the vehicle market by democratizing features and performance that you'd expect out of a more expensive vehicle, providing desirability and affordability in the same package. That's a trick no other company can pull off quite like Tesla, and that's why I said that BYD has reason to be fearful of Tesla. Tesla's just as fierce a competitor as BYD, and the bulk of the vehicle market is at the budget end, where BYD has typically dominated. With all that said, for the time being, a serious all-out competition between BYD and Tesla is likely still a few years away. That's because the greatest market opportunity for EV companies is still to take market share from internal combustion vehicles, because EVs still have a fairly low penetration rate in the overall auto market. BYD and Tesla will increasingly be in direct competition with each other as the decade progresses, but even when that does happen, I think it's safe to say they won't be putting each other out of business. Each company has its own strengths and weaknesses, so they'll coexist with varying levels of dominance in each market and product category. Before we move on, it's worth making a few notes on Europe. Compact vehicles play a large role in the European auto market, and neither Tesla nor BYD are European brands, so they don't have a home court advantage. However, the European automakers don't seem to be putting up much of a fight in the EV space. So, in my view, it's anyone's game. But if Tesla can repeat the performance of the Model Y, which is the best-selling vehicle in Europe of any kind, and introduce a more affordable or compact vehicle, they'll be the one to beat. Coming back to the U.S. market, earlier I said that besides Tesla, U.S. automakers are unable to produce competitive, profitable EVs. But what about in the future? I don't see any other automaker in North America, foreign or domestic, being able to seriously compete with the likes of BYD and Tesla in the next 3 to 5 years. That's because for the most part, they're pulling back on their EV plans rather than making the commitments and changes necessary to become competitive. Some companies, particularly Ford, are making plans to address the challenge posed by China with smaller and lower-cost vehicles. But the question is, if they can't make luxury EVs profitably, how can they expect to make a compact budget vehicle profitably? I just don't see that happening anytime in the next few years. In the meantime, their best hope is high tariffs and other punitive measures to keep any Chinese competition out of the U.S. until they work out how to build a desirable EV profitably. But if the political winds change, or if Chinese companies find a reliable and stable path around the tariffs to enter the U.S. market, the one last bastion where auto manufacturers in the U.S. have a good chance of surviving is in pickup trucks. That's because by the time that BYD and Tesla master conventional pickup truck designs, companies like GM and Ford will have learned enough to produce electric pickup trucks profitably. At least, I hope they do. In summary, China's gearing up to flood Western markets with low-cost EVs. For the U.S. specifically, there are 4 strategies that Chinese automakers could pursue. First, they could ship vehicles directly from China, where the production cost is much lower, but then they would have to pay a 100% tariff. Second, they could build the vehicles in the U.S. to sidestep the tariffs, but given the high cost of labor in the U.S., they would struggle to make low-cost vehicles, which tends to be their biggest strategic advantage. Third, they could build their vehicle factories in Mexico to take advantage of the abundance of low-cost labor there. That would also allow them to sidestep tariffs through the free trade agreement that the U.S. has with Mexico, and allow the Chinese vehicles to qualify for Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. However, that would require them to not just build assembly plants in Mexico, but also rebuild their entire supply chain, which may eliminate all or most of the production cost advantages they have over Tesla and other U.S. automakers. Fourth, given the adversarial relationship between the U.S. and China, Chinese automakers may just choose to avoid the U.S. market for the time being, rather than taking the huge financial risk of relocalizing their supply chains to meet free trade and subsidy requirements. Regardless of which strategy Chinese automakers pursue, Tesla's in a highly competitive position. They continue to be at least 3 to 5 years ahead of every other automaker in terms of production technology, continue to reduce the cost of goods sold for their vehicles, and in the future, they may be in a position to sell their vehicles at cost and earn profits from the software instead of the hardware. As for other U.S. automakers, so far, they're simply not able to produce EVs profitably. Tesla's existence alone is eating into their market share, and with Chinese automakers chomping at the bit to enter Western markets, it's a double whammy. If they're going to survive, they have to either move fast to drive down prices, which Ford is trying to do, retreat to the pickup truck market, or rely on tariffs to effectively block Chinese imports, which may not be an effective long-term solution. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel by using the links in the description. Also, consider following me on X. I often use X as a testbed for sharing ideas, and X subscribers, like my Patreon supporters, generally get access to my videos a week early. On that note, a special thanks to Jeff McJunkin, Asriel1575, my YouTube members, X subscribers, and all the other patrons listed in the credits. I appreciate all of your support, and thanks for tuning in.